The roast was perfect, golden brown, tender, and just the way Frank liked it when he was alive. Eleanor Bennett carved it with precision, sliding the thick slices onto the serving platter, steam curling upward and filling the kitchen with rosemary and garlic. The scent made her eyes prickle not from the herbs, but from memory.
You're just a guest here, Margaret.
The dining table, long and heavy with age, was set with china passed down from her mother. She'd polished the silver that morning, even though no one noticed anymore, across the room. The antique hutch gleamed, filled with crystal goblets that hadn't seen wine in years. The grandchildren were already seated, little Emma fidgeting with her napkin, Luke secretly texting under the table. Eleanor said nothing. She'd given up correcting them. Miranda, of course, noticed, but didn't care. She sat at the head of the table, sipping Chardonnay like a queen at court. Daniel, Eleanor's only son, smiled vaguely as he passed the mashed potatoes. "Smells amazing, Mom," he said. Eleanor gave him a soft nod. "I followed your father's recipe. He always said the trick was a splash of lemon." "I'm sure it's great," Miranda interrupted, reaching for the salt without asking, "though you really should try that low-sodium blend I told you about." Eleanor smiled tightly. "I'm still alive. Miranda, I think I can handle a pinch of salt." Silence. A short, awkward beat. Luke stopped texting. Emma looked up. And then it came. "You're just a guest here, Margaret. Don't forget that." The words dropped like a bomb, casual in delivery, devastating in effect. Eleanor froze. She hadn't heard that name Margaret since her mother scolded her at the age of 9 for tracking dirt into the parlor. She hated it. Everyone knew she went by Eleanor. Everyone. Except Miranda, who used it now like a blade. The room tensed. Even Daniel blinked. Eleanor didn't answer. She looked at the roast, at the crystal goblets, at her lace curtains, swaying gently in the breeze that came through the cracked window over the sink. This was her house. She had painted the shutters with Frank in 1979. She had planted those roses outside with her bare hands. She had buried her husband, raised her son, hosted holidays, and once held Daniel's tiny feet in her lap on this very floor when he had a fever. But somehow, in one sentence, Miranda had rewritten history, had staked a claim, had made her invisible. Eleanor stood, calmly, not shaking. "I think I'll step out for some air," she said. "Enjoy the meal." She walked out before they could respond, grabbed her coat and keys from the wall hook, and stepped into the twilight of a New England evening. The sky was streaked with gray and lavender, the air crisp. She walked to her car, a sensible old Subaru, and started the engine. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. 10 minutes later, she sat in her car in front of Whitman & Co. Realty. The office was dark, closed for the weekend. A for sale sign leaned crookedly against the window inside. She didn't move. She didn't even touch the door handle. Instead, she sat with her hands on the steering wheel, eyes on the building, heart pounding, not with rage but with purpose. It wasn't just a bad comment. It wasn't just a bad night. It was a reckoning. And if they thought they could erase her from her own story, they hadn't the faintest idea who Eleanor Bennett really was. Next. As Eleanor walks through the quiet halls of her house, memories begin to mix with small signs of control, but this time, she starts to see them for what they really are. Ghosts in the hallways. Morning crept in through sheer curtains, casting soft shadows on the hardwood floors of the house Eleanor once called her safe place. The colonial's bones groaned with age, the creak of the stair, the faint whistle through old window panes, but to Eleanor, those sounds were not burdens. They were familiar. They were hers. She stood barefoot in the hallway outside the master bedroom, her fingers grazing the textured wallpaper she and Frank had chosen in 1987. Faded florals, now slightly yellowed by time, but still elegant. They had laughed over how long it took them to agree on a pattern. He wanted blue stripes. She wanted roses. She'd won. Of course, but not without giving him the biggest piece of cake that night in silent thanks. The scent of coffee drifted in from downstairs, but she hadn't made any yet. Odd. She moved toward the kitchen and saw it her morning pills, already laid out on a saucer she didn't use. The dosage wasn't wrong, but it wasn't how she took them. They'd been rearranged again. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She opened the cabinet, found her original pill organizer empty, and realized it had been emptied by someone else. A quiet rearrangement of her habits, cloaked in care. Miranda. In the kitchen. The refrigerator door was ajar. Inside, the milk had been moved to the bottom shelf, out of reach unless she bent low. The leftovers she'd labeled in black marker now missing. Her roast, gone, just like that. Eleanor stood at the sink, hands resting on the cool porcelain edge, eyes unfocused on the frost-beaten view outside. The maple tree in the yard was shedding its final amber leaves. Her rose bushes, lovingly trimmed in the fall, were brittle and ignored. Morning, Daniel mumbled as he entered, tie askew, already fiddling with his phone. Eleanor didn't turn. You rearranged the medicine again. He paused. Miranda just thought it'd be easier this way. You've seemed forgetful lately. I forgot one pill last week. Daniel, once. I was tired. You also left the oven on. I turned it off after dinner. I just didn't hear the click. Daniel sighed. We're not criticizing. Mom, we're trying to help. No, she said, turning to face him. Her voice was even. You're trying to manage me. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor raised a hand. I said goodbye to your father in this house. I brought you up under this roof. I've burned my hands on that stove more times than I care to remember. Don't tell me I don't know when it's off. Daniel softened, but she could see it the way his eyes flicked away. He didn't believe her. Or worse, he was choosing not to. Miranda thinks he began... I know what Miranda thinks, Eleanor said flatly. I was there when she said it, loud and clear. Silence stretched between them. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked. Finally, Daniel broke the stillness. Just be careful, okay? He walked out. Eleanor remained standing in the center of her kitchen. The light overhead flickering faintly, another thing she'd been meaning to fix. But what gnawed at her most wasn't the medication or the milk. It was the sense of slowly becoming a visitor in her own life, of being managed, not loved, of being replaced, not respected. She walked through the house slowly after breakfast. Every room whispered to her. The living room still held the faint scent of wood polish and old books. The guest room had become Miranda's meditation space, sparse, pristine, with a beige throw that didn't match a single thing in the house. Her reading chair in the sunroom had been replaced with a gray leather recliner for your back. Miranda had said. Even the framed photographs had been moved. Frank's picture now sat beside the modem, half blocked by a router. One of Daniel's childhood drawings had disappeared from the hallway wall. And yet, they still said she was the one forgetting. Eleanor opened the small drawer in the writing desk and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside the house deed, the utilities, all still in her name, her will, recently updated, notarized, copies of insurance policies. She stared at the documents for a long while. This wasn't just about irritation anymore. This was about control, quiet, clever control disguised as concern. And Eleanor Bennett had never once in her life given up something that was hers without a reason. She wasn't about to start now. Next, at church, Eleanor begins to realize the battle is larger than she thought. Whispers are spreading and they aren't coming from strangers. The Whisper Campaign. Sunday morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Adelaide's Church, casting patterns of crimson and gold across the pews. The organ music swelled gently through the vaulted ceiling, a familiar hymn Eleanor had known by heart since she was a girl. Normally, she would hum along, but not today. Today. Her lips stayed closed, and her eyes wandered not to the altar, not to the scripture, but to the shifting faces around her. She had arrived early, as she always did, a seat halfway down the right aisle, close enough to hear Father Alton clearly, but far enough back to make a quiet exit if needed. Her regular spot. But as she sat, she noticed something. The subtle changes. The Bakers, who usually sat beside her, now sat 3 rows up. Mrs. Holloway offered only a polite nod, rather than her usual cheerful hug. Even the choir director, Ron, who once helped Frank install the new storm door, barely glanced her way when she waved. Something in the air had changed. After the service, she made her way to the parish hall for coffee and donuts. The room buzzed with conversation and the clinking of paper cups, but it was as if a thin wall had been placed around her. People smiled, but too briefly. They moved on too quickly. She poured her own coffee. No one offered. From behind a tray of blueberry muffins, Margaret Choi, her oldest friend at St. Adelaide's, appeared at her side. "You notice it too," Margaret said softly, handing Eleanor a napkin. "I thought maybe it was just me," Eleanor replied, though the heaviness in her stomach told her otherwise. Margaret leaned closer. "It's not. I overheard Carol Levinson in the Flower Guild meeting. She said Miranda's been mentioning things, slipped medications, oven left on, that you've been getting confused lately." Eleanor stared at her. "That's not true," she said. "I know," Margaret replied, "but it doesn't take truth, just repetition." Eleanor set her coffee down slowly, her hand tightening around the edge of the table. "They're laying the groundwork," she said, more to herself than to Margaret. "For what?" But Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the linoleum as she exited into the crisp autumn air. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached her car. She pressed them against the steering wheel until they steadied. That night, as she returned home, the mailbox held a thick envelope with her name handwritten in careful print, no return address. Inside was a letter, legal stationery, a petition for guardianship. Her breath caught. The words on the page blurred and came back into focus. Filed by Daniel Shaw and Miranda Shaw. They had claimed her health was in noticeable decline, that she had exhibited repeated forgetfulness, that she had become increasingly paranoid. They'd even listed her age as a risk factor, a line that made Eleanor's throat tighten with something between fury and heartbreak. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the letter shaking in her hands. So that was the plan. Isolate her, question her, make her feel small and uncertain, lay the trail of doubt in community ears, then move in under the banner of concern and claim what wasn't theirs. They thought she wouldn't fight, that she wouldn't notice, that her age made her pliable. But they forgot something vital. She had been underestimated before, as a young mother, as a widow, as a woman who ran a household and paid off a mortgage with no help after Frank passed. She had survived grief. She had survived loneliness. And now she would survive this. She picked up the phone and dialed Margaret. "I need that lawyer you mentioned, the one who helped you with the land dispute." "Rachel Holloway," Margaret replied. "That's the one. I need an appointment, tomorrow, if possible." There was a pause. "Eleanor, are you okay?" Eleanor looked at the letter again. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was calm. "No, Margaret, I'm not, but I will be." Next, Eleanor meets Rachel Holloway, a sharp and steady young attorney who doesn't underestimate her. Together, they begin to prepare for a fight Eleanor never thought she'd have to face. Paper shields and old friends. Rachel Holloway's office was tucked between a florist and a nail salon on Main Street, an unassuming second-floor suite with a creaky staircase and the faint smell of lavender drifting in from the shop below. It wasn't grand, but it was orderly bookshelves lined with leather-bound case law. sunlight slanting across a polished oak desk, and a pot of chamomile tea steeping on a tray beside a framed photo of a golden retriever. Eleanor Bennett, wearing her navy coat and clutching her handbag like a shield, sat straight-backed in the visitor's chair. She had dressed with care, pink curls brushed out, pearls at her throat. The air outside had been cold, but her expression was composed flinty. Even across from her sat Rachel, mid-30s, sharp-eyed and listening more than she spoke. She had a quiet confidence about her, the kind that came from knowing the law like a second language and using it like a sword when needed. Eleanor slid the guardianship petition across the desk. "They've been working on this for months," she said, voice calm but edged, starting with whispers, then meddling with my medications. "Now this." Rachel flipped through the paperwork, her pen tapping lightly against the margins. "I have seen these tactics before," she said. "This one's dressed in nice fonts and polite concern, but it's built on control, not care." Eleanor allowed herself the faintest smile. Rachel looked up. "Do you manage your own finances?" "Every dollar," Eleanor replied. "I paid off my mortgage 22 years ago. I maintain my investments. I balance my checkbook, and I haven't missed a tax filing since Nixon was in office." Rachel nodded. "Good. How's your memory?" "I forgot to salt the potatoes last Christmas. Other than that, I'm sharper than my son, who somehow managed to overdraw a joint account we don't even use." Now Rachel smiled. "Then we'll start there. I want 3 things: a full assessment from your physician documenting your health and cognition, proof of financial independence, and any witnesses who can speak to your daily habits, friends, neighbors, pastor. We'll build a portfolio that buries this petition in facts." Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila folder, thick with records, bank statements, utility bills, correspondence, even a photocopy of the deed. Rachel's eyebrows lifted. "You came prepared." "I'm old, not passive." There was a pause. Mutual respect hung in the air. Rachel took a sip of tea. "Mrs. Bennett, Eleanor, you should know this won't be easy. They've laid groundwork. Once these cases go public, perception becomes sticky. People talk. Judges get cautious. The burden will be on you to prove that you're competent." Eleanor sat taller. "I didn't spend a lifetime raising a man only for him to erase me with the signature." Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying her client. "They don't know who they're dealing with." Eleanor's voice was steady. "They will—" That night, Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror, her reflection lit by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. She watched herself carefully, the lines at the corners of her mouth, the streaks of silver in her hair, the set of her shoulders. There was a weariness, yes, but beneath it, something older, rooted. She opened the top drawer of her dresser and removed the box of stationery. She began to write letters to friends from church, to her pastor, even to Carol Levinson, whose loyalties had tilted dangerously close to Miranda's. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for truth. "Have you noticed changes in my behavior, in my memory? If so, please be honest. If not, I'd appreciate your support. I have always stood by others. I hope some will stand by me now." Her handwriting was slow but sure. 3 days later, she met Rachel again. The physician's report was glowing. Eleanor Bennett is alert, oriented, and in full command of her faculties. Pastor James had agreed to testify. Margaret Choi would too. Even Carol, shamed by Eleanor's honesty, sent a short but meaningful reply. "You've always been steady. If there's anything I can do, say the word." Rachel stacked the growing pile of documents into a case binder. "We're ready to answer." Eleanor looked out the window of the small law office, where a woman across the street watered potted mums outside the hardware store. Life, as always, went on. But inside, something had shifted. She was no longer reacting. She was moving forward. Next, Miranda and Daniel stage an intervention under the guise of concern, but Eleanor is no longer the woman they underestimated. and this time she won't let them speak over her. The intervention. The invitation came on a Wednesday afternoon, folded neatly on the kitchen counter beneath the grocery list Eleanor had written in her own hand. A single sheet of fixed stationery, with the family crest embossed in silver at the top, a detail Eleanor had never approved of, but Miranda had insisted upon when she ordered it years ago. It wasn't a letter, not exactly, it was a tone. Mom, we'd love to have a family conversation this weekend, just the three of us. Nothing formal, just an honest talk about what's best for everyone. Saturday at 3 here at the house. Love, Daniel. Eleanor read it twice. She wasn't invited. She was summoned. Saturday arrived cold and damp, the kind of mid-autumn day that left everything slick with anticipation. The sky was overcast, as if the clouds themselves had chosen to withhold approval. At exactly 2:59, Eleanor walked into the parlor of her own home, her hair fixed neatly, sweater buttoned, hands empty. She needed no defense but her presence. Daniel sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair, his elbows on his knees. Miranda stood behind him, arms crossed, a performance in posture. A pitcher of water and 3 glasses sat untouched on the coffee table. No tea, no warmth. Thanks for coming, Mom, Daniel said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I live here, Eleanor replied, but you're welcome. Miranda's mouth twitched. Please, sit. This is a safe space. Eleanor arched an eyebrow but took her place on the couch upright, composed. There was a pause. Then Miranda began. We've noticed some changes lately. Small things at first, misplaced keys, missed appointments, a bit of confusion. Eleanor said nothing. She let the words fall like rain on a roof, harmless when you know the structure can hold. Daniel chimed in. We love you. Mom, we're not judging. We're just worried. Things are different now. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Different how, she asked? Miranda leaned forward, her voice silk over steel. You left the oven on. You've mixed up names at church. The other day you were driving and missed the turn to the house. I was thinking, Eleanor said softly, it's still legal to think while driving, isn't it? Daniel shifted. It's not about legality. It always is, Eleanor said, cutting him off, because what you're really saying is that I shouldn't be making decisions anymore. Miranda's smile thinned. We just want you to be safe. What if something happened? What if you forgot something important? Eleanor stood. The room stilled. I'll tell you what I haven't forgotten, she said, voice low and certain. I haven't forgotten how to manage my finances. I haven't forgotten how to pay my bills, or bake a roast, or tend the garden, or recognize when I'm being pulled. Daniel stood too. Mom, please, that's not what this is. It is exactly what this is. Her eyes moved between them. You've both decided that my age equals decline, that gray hair equals incompetence, but you don't live in my body. You don't live in my mind. You don't even live in this house. Miranda's voice sharpened. We're just trying to help. If you'd agree to a proper facility, a guardian, someone objective. Eleanor's laugh was soft, sad. I already have someone objective. Her name is Rachel Holloway, and she'll see you in court. A silence fell, thick and sudden. Daniel blinked. You got a lawyer? Eleanor nodded. I've submitted a full response to your petition, doctor's assessment, financial records, witnesses, all of it, and if this goes further, I'll see it through. To the very end. Miranda stepped forward, tone laced with false concern. Eleanor, this is exhausting. It's not necessary. It became necessary, Eleanor said firmly. The moment you stood in my kitchen and called me a guest. She turned to Daniel. I raised you better than this, but if you choose to let her do the talking for you, you'll lose more than this house. You'll lose me. For the first time, Daniel's face cracked, a flicker of shame. Eleanor gathered her coat from the back of the chair. I suggest you both leave for now. I have a life to continue living. Without another word, she walked to the front door, opened it, and held it wide. Miranda hesitated. You'll regret this. Eleanor looked her in the eye. No, I regret waiting this long. As the door closed behind them, Eleanor exhaled. Not a sigh of relief. A breath of clarity. She stepped into the hallway and noticed Frank's old cane leaning against the wall. She picked it up not for support, but for memory, for steadiness, for something to hold as she faced what was next. She was no longer defending herself. She was fighting back. Next, the courtroom doors open. Accusations fly, but Eleanor's voice, steady and clear, cuts through. It's time for the truth to take the stand. The hearing begins. The courthouse in Millbrook Heights was a stately old building, its stone facade weathered by decades of disputes and resolutions, triumphs and failures. It didn't shimmer like the glossy offices Miranda favored. It stood like Eleanor, solid, seasoned, and full of memory. It was raining the morning of the hearing, not a heavy downpour, but a thin, misty drizzle that blurred the windows and soaked the cuffs of trousers and hems of coats. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes early. She wore a dark green wool coat, her late husband Frank's wedding band on a thin chain around her neck, and a pair of polished boots that clicked cleanly against the marble floor. Rachel Holloway stood waiting near the clerk's office, sleek in a navy blazer, calm as a mountain lake. "You ready?" she asked, offering a soft smile. Eleanor nodded once. "I've lived 70 years. Today is just another one." Rachel's lips curved slightly. "Good. That's exactly how we'll treat it." They entered the courtroom. Inside, Miranda and Daniel were already seated at the petitioner's table. Miranda wore a cream pantsuit, her makeup impeccable, her posture studied. Daniel looked pale, slightly wilted around the edges. He didn't meet Eleanor's gaze. The judge, Honorable Irene Norwood, entered with efficient grace, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, no nonsense, a gavel strike. All rose, all sat, and so it began. Rachel opened with clarity. "We contend that Mrs. Eleanor Bennett is not only fully competent but is currently being targeted through manipulative familial tactics designed to wrest control of her property and her independence." The judge nodded, unimpressed by drama. The opposing attorney, a smooth-voiced man in designer glasses, took the floor. "Your Honor, this petition is not about property or power. It's about safety. About a family deeply concerned for their elderly mother's well-being. We've observed behavior consistent with cognitive decline, misplaced items, difficulty recalling names, even incidents involving household safety." Miranda sat forward slightly, her expression polished to pity. Eleanor didn't flinch. "They called Daniel first." His voice was soft, uncertain, as if he were stumbling through fog. "She left the stove on once, and she forgot where she parked at church. I don't think she's incompetent. I don't know if she's safe by herself anymore." Rachel rose. "Mr. Shaw, has your mother missed a mortgage payment?" "No." "Failed to pay a bill?" "No." "Driven unsafely?" "Received a citation, injured herself in the home." Daniel shifted. "Not that I know of." "Have you lived with her recently?" He paused. "No." Rachel nodded. No further questions. Then came Miranda. She took the stand like a performer awaiting applause. "She's proud. She won't ask for help, but I've seen it the signs. She repeats herself. She accused me of moving things in the house, but I think she just forgets where they are." Rachel approached slowly, like a careful chess player. "Mrs. Shaw, are you a medical professional?" "No." "Do you have training in cognitive assessment?" "No." "You say Mrs. Bennett forgets where things are. Could it be possible you moved them?" Miranda blinked, only for her convenience. Rachel smiled faintly. "Is it true you have discussed plans to sell Mrs. Bennett's home?" Miranda froze. I may have mentioned it to Danielle. We were brainstorming possibilities. And you were planning to move in after she relocated to assisted living. Silence. I don't recall saying that. Rachel stepped away, no further questions. Eleanor's heart beat steadily. This was her moment. Rachel nodded to her. Mrs. Bennett, please take the stand. She rose slowly, not because she was weak, but because she wanted the room to feel the weight of her steps. She took the oath, sat. Mrs. Bennett, Rachel said, can you tell us about your daily routine? Eleanor spoke clearly. I wake up around 6:30. I read the newspaper on paper, not a screen. I walk the garden if it's warm. I pay bills every Friday. I volunteer at the church pantry on Thursdays. I balance my checkbook monthly. I take my medication as prescribed. I have friends, a life, a mind, and I'm fully capable of managing all three. Rachel handed her a document. Do you recognize this? My physician's report. It says I am mentally sharp and physically capable. And this? My bank statement, balanced to the penny. There was silence in the room. Judge Norwood leaned forward. Mrs. Bennett, why do you think your son and daughter-in-law filed this petition? Eleanor looked directly at Miranda, then at Daniel. Because I said no. Because I didn't hand them the house. Because I didn't fold myself neatly into their plans. And because, in their eyes, getting older means giving up. But I have not given up. I am not confused. I am not in decline. I am simply not done yet. Her voice didn't shake. The judge looked down at her notes, then at Daniel, then at Miranda. We will reconvene tomorrow for the ruling, she said, striking the gavel. All rose. As Eleanor stepped down from the stand, Rachel placed a hand on her shoulder. You were brilliant. Eleanor breathed deeply. I was honest. That's all I ever needed to be. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but it felt less heavy. Tomorrow, the judge would decide her fate. But tonight, Eleanor had already reclaimed something more important than permission. She had reclaimed her voice. Next, the courtroom returns to session. A decision is made, but the consequences ripple far beyond the judge's bench. Eleanor stands ready for victory, or whatever comes next. Testimony and truth. The courthouse hallway echoed with muted footsteps the next morning. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes early, not out of nerves, but out of habit. Punctuality had been a kind of discipline in her life, a quiet defiance of chaos. Today, it served another purpose: control. Control over how she entered the space, how she was seen. She wore her deep plum blazer, the one with the subtle floral embroidery along the cuffs, and pinned the brooch, her mother's pearl, just above her heart. She touched the frame of Frank's photo before leaving the house, whispering, "Wish me strength." And now? She sat outside the courtroom, legs crossed, back straight, heart steady. Rachel appeared at her side. She didn't speak at first, just handed Eleanor a warm cup of black tea in a to-go cup. No sugar, no lemon, just the way Eleanor liked it. You ready, Rachel finally asked. I was born ready. Eleanor replied with a thin smile, but I didn't know it until now. Inside, the courtroom settled into stillness. Judge Norwood entered, her face unreadable, a stack of papers before her. The gavel struck. All rose, all sat. Before the ruling, Rachel had called one final witness, Pastor James Ellery, tall, silver-haired, and warm-voiced. Pastor James took the stand with a calm reverence. The courtroom seemed to breathe with him. Pastor Ellery, Rachel began. How long have you known Mrs. Bennett? 32 years, he said. I married her son, baptized her grandchildren. I sat beside her the day we buried her husband. I've known her through every season of this life. Have you ever observed behavior that would suggest she is cognitively impaired or unable to care for herself? He smiled. Eleanor runs the church pantry. She manages donations, supervises volunteers, and organizes monthly events. Last week, She caught a clerical error in our financial records that even I missed. I rely on her. We all do. There was a moment of pause. Then Rachel asked gently, in your opinion, is she mentally sound? I trust her with my own affairs. Pastor James said without hesitation. Eleanor's chest lifted, air moving deeper than before. Carol Levinson testified next. A friend turned doubter, now visibly remorseful. I believed rumors, she admitted. Twisting a tissue in her lap, Miranda had a way of sounding concerned. But after receiving Eleanor's letter, I started paying attention. And I realized I was the one who forgot who she is, not the other way around. Rachel let the moment settle, then returned to the judge's bench. Your Honor, we rest our case. There was no rebuttal, no more words from Miranda, no more protests from Daniel, only silence. Judge Norwood scanned her notes, then turned to the room. I've reviewed the petition, the medical and financial documents, and heard testimony from those closest to Mrs. Bennett. She looked at Eleanor, then at Miranda. There is no evidence to suggest Eleanor Bennett is incapable of managing her affairs. In fact, the opposite is true. The court finds the guardianship petition both unfounded and coercive in intent. Miranda's jaw clenched. The judge continued. Effective immediately. The petition is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, given the manipulative nature of the filing, a temporary restraining order will be issued preventing the petitioners from making further attempts to seize control of Mrs. Bennett's estate or assets without court approval. The gavel struck. Eleanor didn't move right away. It was over. And yet, it was just beginning. Rachel leaned in, whispering, "You did it." "No," Eleanor whispered back. "We did it." Outside, the courthouse steps glistened with rainwater, a fine mist still hanging in the air. Eleanor stood at the top for a moment, the wind tugging gently at her scarf. Below, the town moved on cars passing, people unaware of what had just shifted. Daniel emerged a few minutes later, hands deep in his coat pockets. "Mom." She turned to him but said nothing. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said. I thought you were struggling." "You wanted me to be," she replied, her voice firm, "because that would have made it easier for you to justify taking what wasn't yours." Daniel's face flushed. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't undo damage." "Daniel, it doesn't erase what you signed, what you allowed." He nodded slowly. Ashamed. "I'll give you space." He murmured, "I think that's wise." Eleanor turned from him, not in anger, but in choice. She had stood in a courtroom and defended her life, her legacy, herself. She would not waste another minute shrinking. That evening, as dust settled across Millbrook Heights, Eleanor made herself a small supper: grilled cheese, tomato soup, and a slice of apple tart she'd saved for just such a moment. She sat in the sunroom, the sound of rain soft against the windows, and opened a new journal. The first line she wrote was simple. Today, I defended my name. Tomorrow, I reclaim my life. Next, the dust settles, but not everyone walks away whole. Eleanor must decide what peace looks like now, and whether there's room for healing, or if some things are better left behind. The gavel falls the day after the verdict. The sun returned to Millbrook Heights like a forgotten promise, gentle, low, and golden, washing over Eleanor's white colonial house in long strips of morning light. She watched it rise from the kitchen window, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea, the warmth radiating through her palms and into her bones. It was quiet, not the stiff, uncertain quiet of tension, but the kind that felt earned. She stood barefoot on the tile floor, the scent of toast in the air, and listened to the creaks and whispers of a house at peace again. No voices arguing in the hallway, no papers being shuffled behind her back, no more Miranda, no more schemes. The silence was hers now. Mid-morning brought a knock at the door, not firm, not hesitant, familiar. When Eleanor opened it, Daniel stood there, his eyes sunken with sleep or shame. Maybe both. He held a paper bag in one hand, awkwardly. "I brought pastries," he said. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The kitchen felt smaller with him there, memories crowding the space. Daniel placed the bag on the table and took a seat. He didn't touch the coffee she offered, just sat, hands folded. "I wanted to say something yesterday," he began, voice strained, "but I didn't know how." Eleanor stirred her tea without looking at him. "You knew how to sign the petition." He winced. "I know." A long silence stretched. "Miranda's gone," he said at last. "She left this morning. I asked her to." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, finally meeting his eyes. "Because of me, no," he admitted. "Because of me. Because I let her turn me into someone I didn't recognize." Eleanor said nothing. Daniel pressed on. "When Dad died, I thought I had to step up, take care of everything. But Miranda, she didn't want to help. She wanted control, and I let her." Eleanor looked out the window, her expression unreadable. "You didn't just let her," she said softly. "You handed her the keys." "I did." Daniel lowered his head. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." His voice cracked. "I didn't know how to protect you." "I never needed protecting," Eleanor replied. "I needed to be heard." He stayed for an hour. They didn't laugh. They didn't cry. They simply spoke like strangers trying to remember who they once were to each other before he left. He paused in the doorway. "I'd like to come by again, if you'll let me. Not for anything big, just to sit, to talk." Eleanor studied him, her son, the boy who used to bring her dandelions from the yard, the man who let someone else silence her. "I'll let you know," she said. Daniel nodded, accepting that. He left without a hug, but with the weight of truth finally resting on his shoulders. Later that afternoon, Eleanor stepped outside into her back garden. Frank's roses had begun to brown. She trimmed them gently, gloves on, shears glinting in the sunlight. Each cut was precise, removing what no longer served the bloom, just like her life. She moved through the rows with practiced ease, boots crunching on gravel, the scent of earth rich and real near the old bird bath. She paused, bent down, dug her fingers into the soil. It was still fertile, still full of life, just like her. That evening, as golden hours settled across the lawn, Eleanor opened the windows in every room. The house breathed again. Curtains swayed. The sun painted the walls honey and soft blush. She walked through each room with purpose, straightened the frame, lit a candle, set her reading glasses on the end table beside her chair, the right chair, not the recliner Miranda had placed there, in the hallway. She paused at a shelf of photo albums. One in particular caught her eye, leather-bound, edges worn from decades of hands thumbing through. She sat in her sunroom and opened it, inside Daniel as a toddler in her arms, Frank on a ladder hanging Christmas lights. The house behind them, still white, still strong, her family, her foundation, her legacy. When night fell, Eleanor stood on the porch, the stars peeking through a velvet sky. She breathed deep. The chill in the air no longer felt sharp, it felt fresh. Her life was no longer slipping away quietly. It was hers again, fully, firmly, and whatever came next, she would face it standing. Next, the final chapter. Eleanor chooses peace, but on her own terms, with legal victory behind her and her house restored. She reflects on what she lost, what she reclaimed, and the new future she dares to shape. Roses and regret. The following morning was wrapped in quiet sunlight, the kind that slid lazily through windows and warmed the hardwood floors under bare feet. Eleanor padded through the house in her robe, her teacup steady in one hand, the other trailing the edge of the wainscoting Frank had installed the year after Daniel was born. She paused in the foyer. where the light caught on a photograph newly restored to its rightful place Frank on their wedding day. Tea crooked, eyes full of mischief. She reached out and adjusted the frame with care. The house finally felt like it had exhaled in the garden. The frost had kissed the rose petals overnight. Eleanor walked the path slowly, the hem of her robe brushing the tops of cold lavender bushes. She trimmed away the brittle stems from her rose beds, breath rising in little clouds. Each snip of her shears was deliberate, measured. She had always believed gardening to be a kind of prayer. She was midway through the third bush when she heard the familiar crunch of gravel. Turning, she saw Daniel coat zipped, hands buried in his pockets, standing awkwardly at the gate. He raised one hand in a small wave. "I brought coffee," he said. Eleanor regarded him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Leave your shoes at the door." Inside, the warmth enveloped them like an old quilt. Daniel sat at the kitchen table while Eleanor rinsed her gloves at the sink. He placed a brown paper bag on the counter beside her. "Pumpkin scones," he said, trying a smile. "From that bakery on Elm." She glanced at the bag but said nothing. The kettle hissed behind her. Daniel cleared his throat. "I spoke with Miranda. Told her I'm moving forward with the divorce." Eleanor turned, surprised but guarded. "That's a big step. It was long overdue." He said, "I let her convince me I was doing the right thing, that taking over your affairs was protecting you. But it wasn't. It was about control. And I let her speak for me because it was easier than disappointing her." Eleanor pulled 2 mugs from the cupboard. "And what about disappointing me?" He looked down. "I didn't just disappoint you. Mom, I betrayed you." She placed the mugs on the table with a soft clink. "Yes," she said, sitting across from him. "You did." They sat in silence as the steam rose between them. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the oak tree Frank had planted the year Daniel was born. "I don't expect forgiveness," Daniel said after a long pause, "but I do hope for another chance." Eleanor stirred her tea gently. "When your father died," she began, "I remember sitting right here, thinking the worst was behind me, that I'd survived the hardest chapter. But these past few months have been a different kind of grief. Not just the betrayal, but the slow realization that the boy I raised was willing to doubt me." "I didn't want to," Daniel whispered. "But you did." She looked up, and for the first time in weeks, there was no fire in her eyes, just honesty. "You let someone else speak for me, Daniel. You erased me from my own life. I can't forget that, but..." He looked up, hopeful. "I believe in repair. Not always reconciliation, but repair." He swallowed. "What does that look like, you coming over on Sundays?" she said. "No paperwork, no agendas. Just you, sitting, listening, learning who I am again." Daniel nodded, tears glistening but unspilled. "I can do that. Then we'll begin there." Later, after he left, Eleanor returned to her garden. The trimmed roses stood prouder now, bare but hopeful. She knelt beside the roots and tucked in fresh mulch, fingers coated in earth. A new season was coming, and though much had been lost, trust, innocence, the illusion of unbreakable bonds, something else had been unearthed, a clarity, a strength, a promise to herself. She would live the rest of her days not as a character in someone else's story, but as the author of her own. Next, in the final chapter, Eleanor reclaims more than her home. She rediscovers the quiet joy of living on her own terms as she writes the next chapter of her life. One thing becomes clear: she was never a guest in her home, only waiting to reclaim the keys. The deed in her hands. It was a Wednesday when the final envelope arrived thick, official, stamped with the golden seal of the county court. Eleanor sat in her sunroom when she opened it, the late morning light glinting off her teacup, birdsong threading in from the garden just outside. She didn't rush. She used her silver letter opener, the one Frank had given her, for their 20th anniversary and unfolded the crisp documents with deliberate care. Her fingers didn't tremble. They were steady now, seasoned. There, in bold black print, were the final words that mattered: petition dismissed, estate and decision-making rights retained, competency affirmed, and just beneath that, the deed to her house reaffirmed, refiled, signed, sealed, hers. No conditions, no co-signers, no whispers behind her back. She laid the papers flat across her lap and sat back, breathing it in, not just a legal victory, but something deeper, the profound quiet of ownership. Not just of land and walls and furniture, but of self, of voice, of dignity, of future. She stood later that afternoon on the front porch, a fresh breeze lifting the hem of her blouse across the lawn. The hedges had grown a bit wild. She would trim them this weekend. She'd already made a list plant winter bulbs, scrub the shutters, repaint the porch rail where the wood had chipped. Not because she had to, because she could. The mailman passed by and gave her a little wave. "Mrs. Bennett," he said with a grin. "You're looking sharper than ever." She smiled. "I feel it." She walked back inside, passing the grandfather clock in the hall, ticking steady as breath. She'd spent the morning rearranging things, not out of anger, out of intention. The gray recliner Miranda had purchased was now in the garage, wrapped in plastic, in its place. Eleanor had restored her soft green armchair, the one with worn velvet arms and the tiny tear on the left cushion. She placed Frank's old pipe on the side table beside it, not to use, just to remember. In the kitchen, the spice rack was in its rightful order, paprika no longer in front of the salt. Her teacups all faced the same direction. The photograph of her wedding day was centered above the fireplace. No one had dared touch it since the ruling, but she centered it anyway. She had reclaimed everything. By mid-evening, she was at her desk in the study, outside. The garden was swaying under a gentle breeze, and the sound of wind chimes carried in like distant laughter. She opened a fresh journal. At the top of the first page, she wrote in elegant cursive, "I was never losing my mind. I was losing my place in their narrative, and now I write my own." She paused, then added, "This house is mine. But more importantly, this life is..." She wrote for hours memories, reflections, lessons. She didn't know what the journal would become. A book, a gift to her grandchildren. One day, a record of survival. She didn't need to know. What mattered was the act of putting herself into her own story again. That night, Eleanor made herself a bowl of butternut squash soup and lit a candle at the center of the table. She poured a glass of rare wine, the same kind Frank used to bring home when they had fancy nights, even if it was just with spaghetti. She raised her glass to the empty chair across from her and whispered, "We did it," not because she needed to say it aloud, but because the house deserved to hear it, and maybe Frank, too. When she stepped out onto the porch before bed, the stars were brilliant, sharp and high, the sky so clear it made her ache. She wrapped herself in a knit shawl and sat on the porch swing, legs tucked beneath her. No fear, no shame, no pressure to move, to yield, to disappear. Just peace, and the knowledge that she had won back more than bricks and beams. She had won herself, and that made all the difference. If you loved Eleanor's journey of resilience and quiet strength, imagine the untold stories waiting behind every front door. Stay tuned for the next story in this family drama series where generations collide, secrets surface, and one decision can change everything.